Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. My name is Brittany McGee, and I'm the Next Generation Officer here at the Council. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the highly anticipated Young Professionals program on the rise of commercial marijuana in the U.S. FYI, that was my first and last pun of the evening. A few housekeeping points before we begin. Tonight's program is live and on the record, so please silence your phones, but keep them at the ready, as we'll be taking questions through our online survey technology, the link to which you can find on the screen on either side of me. We will also be conducting some live polling throughout the program, so be sure to contribute your opinion through our survey system as well. Simply type chi.cnf.io into your device browser and select tonight's program to submit your question for consideration and vote in the live polls tonight. And don't forget to engage on social media and tag #CouncilYP in your posts. As you're tweeting, though, know that views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. For nearly a century, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. We engage not only the world and nation's top leaders, but also Chicago's next generation of leaders, with programming to increase your global fluency and cultural competence. I encourage you, if you are not a member with us, to join and participate in our Young Professionals Network. There's a table in the back where you can drop in your contact information and we'll follow up with you. Back to tonight's program. Multiple sources posit that estimated demand for marijuana would top all ice cream sales in the US. Now, we don't have ice cream for you guys tonight, but we do have a well-versed pair of experts with us to speak on the different factors of adopting a federal legislation policy and on how the quite booming cannabis industry can do so inclusively. In the conversation tonight are John Hudak and Dina Rollman. John Hudak is the Deputy Director of the Center for Effective Public Management and a Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institute. He served as the Program Director and as a Graduate Fellow at the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. John quite literally wrote the book on marijuana, as he's the author of Marijuana, A Short History. He's received his BA in Political Science and Economics from the University of Connecticut, as well as a master's and PhD in Political Science from Vanderbilt University. Dina Rollman is the Chief Counsel of Compliance at Green Thumb Industries. She is the founder and president of Illinois Women in Cannabis and recently taught as an adjunct professor at Chicago Kent College of Law. Dina previously served as a commercial litigation partner, and she holds a bachelor's degree from Oberlin College and a Juris Doctorate from Northwestern University. Moderating tonight's discussion is Council Resident Fellow Michael Taboris. Michael's current research projects address the ethics and politics of water scarcity and the effects of resource depletion on global justice and best policy practices. He is also a public fellow for the American Council of Learned Societies. Michael holds a PhD in ethics and political philosophy from the University of California, San Diego. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming John Hudak and Dina Rollman.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for being here. This is a great topic, and I anticipate an excellent discussion. As Brittany mentioned, please add questions as we go along, and we'll bring some of them up at the end. So I'm going to just jump right in. Marijuana is a Schedule I controlled substance according to federal law. And what that means is that the government regards it as having a high potential for abuse and for having no acceptable medical uses. But most US states disagree with this to some degree. 8 states have fully legalized recreational and medical marijuana use. DC has as well, but recreational commercial sale is not allowed. 38 states have legalized various forms of medical marijuana. Nebraska has decriminalized possession but not use. And in only 3 states, Kansas, South Dakota, and Idaho is marijuana possession and sale completely illegal. So this indicates a lot of variety in both reasoning and politics at the state level, but also a kind of clear trend toward further liberalization. So John, let me start with you. Why is there so much variety? And is full legalization and federal acceptance of this more or less inevitable over time?
Sure. Well, first, thanks for hosting. Thank you to the council. Thanks all of you for coming. Marijuana tends to draw out crowds, and tonight, of course, did not disappoint, and I'm glad to see a lot of faces in the room. To your question, why is there so much diversity in the states? This grows initially because the federal government, as you said, considers marijuana illegal in all cases, no questions asked. But states have been experimenting with this policy area now for 21 years, starting first with California legalizing medical marijuana in 1996. And what has happened is public opinion has changed in dramatic ways that has not matched a federal response. So when you rewind back to the early 90s, you see support for medical marijuana being support for recreational marijuana being around 18%, 19% nationally. It's now 64% in a period of less than 30 years. Support for medical marijuana now pulls somewhere usually between 85 and 90%. Despite that, federal policy has not changed, and so states have taken it upon themselves to do this. And when states operate as the laboratories of democracy, you tend to get a lot of very different, sometimes pretty screwy policies, and some states get it right a little better than others. But what you end up having is this continuum between very permissive policy and very restrictive policy. In some cases, you can only have a non-intoxicating extract from the plant that can only be used within the state, but it can't be produced within the state, oftentimes for epilepsy in children only. And then you have other states where you can get medical marijuana if you have chronic headaches or other types of chronic pain, and everything in between. And that's what happens when you leave states up to their own devices, and that's what the federal government has done with marijuana.
So Dina, let's talk about Illinois specifically, and Chicago specifically. Very recently, Illinois seems to be considering broader legalization as a way to deal with its financial situation. So can you speak a little bit about that and about Chicago specifically?
Sure. I mean, it's been a very interesting evolution in Illinois. Illinois legalized medical marijuana through statute rather than through voter referendum back in 2013, and the law took effect in 2014. And at that time, medical marijuana statute only passed by one vote. It's a very tight vote, lots of sausage making went on behind the scenes and lots of negotiation. Now, you know, the world has changed even in Springfield, where it's just not even a controversial issue anymore. If it were to be put to a vote today, medical marijuana would probably be essentially unopposed. And what's been introduced now in the state legislature is an adult use bill. It's not being put to a vote just yet. They're doing a lot of meeting with different interest groups to figure out what should an adult use bill look like in Illinois. And just as that's been picking up steam in Springfield, we now have the Cook County getting in on the act. John Fritchie has introduced a bill to legalize adult use in Cook County. It's not something he can do on his own, but basically they're just trying to get this conversation going in the county. And so far it seems that it's also just not controversial at the county level. And it's also thought that it will sort of jibe well with decriminalization, which has happened on the state level and on the county level. And I think we'll talk more about that, that tension between legalization and decriminalization.
Yeah, I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about public attitudes and policies. So it sort of sounds like from both of you, public opinion is quite different than the federal policy. And even at the state level, the state policymakers have a different attitude than the federal policy. So John, maybe we'll start with you. What's the main obstacle for bringing policy and opinion here together? What's preventing that from happening?
Well, political scientists would tell you that mass opinion, that is public opinion among the public, tends to lead elite opinion, that is, opinion among elected officials and appointed officials. And that's what's happening with marijuana legalization. You have a group of elected officials who have been raised, and I don't mean raised as children, but raised professionally in an environment where the war on drugs was popular. Being tough on crime, tough on drugs was something that got you elected, it got you pork back to your district, and was something that was the safe position, whether you were a Democrat or a Republican. What's happening now, though, is while those changes in public opinion are happening, and elected officials can look out at their districts or their states and say, wow, you know, my voters really support this, there's still that gun shyness about taking that step toward reform for a lot of legislators. And part of the reason for that is not the level of support that people have when it comes to marijuana legalization, it's the intensity of support. So when you look at Gallup polling over the past 50 years, since they started asking questions about marijuana legalization, marijuana has never been a top 20 issue in terms of importance among voters. Voters care about the economy, depending on the time of life. They are worried about terrorism, they're worried about jobs, national security, et cetera. They tend not to care about marijuana one way or the other. So if you vote against as an elected official, if you vote against your voters' interests on a jobs bill or a tax bill or a health care bill, you're probably going to be held to account. But if you vote in a different direction on marijuana, there are 20, 30, 40 other issues that your voters are going to judge you on first. And it creates this scenario in which there's a real stalemate between what the public wants and what elected officials want.
So that's interesting. I want to ask a slightly more philosophical question building on those things. And Dina, you can take the first whack at this, or you can throw it.
Okay.
So should public support matter for how the government regulates an intoxicant, right? So like the public might have a different attitude about this stuff than they might, we might have really broad support for legalization. Does that matter for whether or not the government should regulate it?
I would argue yes, for sure. We've seen public opinion change on this in part because people were very fearful that cannabis was a gateway drug, and if people used cannabis, they would get to the harder stuff, or crime would increase, or teen access would increase. And so I think part of the reason why you've seen the public opinion sway in favor of legalization is a lot of these fears haven't been realized. And so on that continuum, if the fears aren't realized and we're not seeing these bad effects for society, then I think when we look at, well, why are legislators not listening to their constituents? At that point, they should have a really good, concrete reason to disregard the will of the people. And if the science doesn't back that up, medical studies don't back that up, and certainly tax revenue doesn't back that up, then I think they're out of arguments.
So yeah, just to pick up on that, I agree with that entirely. On a lot of issues, there is a disconnect, sort of an informational disconnect between what elected officials understand about not just the details of policy, but the longer term consequences of policy, and what the public does. Public policy is very difficult. The average person does not have time to sit down and read legislation and think through legislation and think about what the consequences of that legislation are. They have to go to work and put food on the table and raise kids and do a variety of other things. Elected officials have that time and are supposed to, although they don't always, they're supposed to put in that kind of work. And so oftentimes elected officials understand a piece of legislation or an issue better than an average constituent, typically. On marijuana, that's not the case. I go around the country giving talks like these pretty often, and I talk to a lot of people, and they know a lot about this issue. I also talk to members of Congress. They don't know anything about this issue. They still think marijuana is a gateway drug. That's been proven to be incorrect. They think marijuana is highly addicting compared to alcohol, nicotine, heroin, cocaine. It is not as addictive if you use a measure of addiction as the percentage of users who have a use disorder, a diagnosable use disorder. There is a lot that elected officials do not understand about marijuana. They also think it doesn't have medical benefits. There are a lot of researchers in this nation's most prestigious medical schools and other research institutions and institutions across the world who would disagree. A lot of voters understand that. A lot of House members and senators and state legislators and governors don't. So normally, I would take pause in the idea that what a majority of citizens want is necessarily the best thing or the best policy. But in this case, they're a little better read up on this issue than the average elected official.
Now, so public opinion matters, of course, here, but I mean, let's be honest, ultimately, I think the market, and you can disagree with this, right? That is the market for this going to just drive policy on it ultimately, right? I mean, if there's a good market case to be made, some states are watching other states making substantial tax revenue on the basis of legalization. Is that really ultimately what is going to tip the scales here? Deanna, would you say?
Well, I mean, one thing that I think this issue always begs is the comparison to the alcohol industry. And so, sort of one of the things that makes people uncomfortable about cannabis is that people enjoy using it. It can be a medical product, but it's also, termed recreational. It's something you do for fun. And there's, maybe a discomfort there. But then, when you look at I don't think anyone's ready to put the genie back in the bottle in terms of alcohol. People drink alcohol. There's no medical benefit really, other than maybe a slight risk of heart disease if you drink, one glass of wine here and there, whatever. But for the most part, people aren't drinking alcohol for any health benefit whatsoever. It is addictive. I mean, we know all the societal problems that flow from alcohol consumption, and there's really zero desire and zero movement in the country to go back to prohibition. So, with cannabis, it seems like how are we assuming this is going to end up anywhere other than the same path as what happened with prohibition? It's just it's going to seem outdated at some point.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I can imagine somebody saying about this sort of thing, though, look, alcohol and tobacco use have bad consequences, and we're right to regulate those things. If we further liberalize, I mean, even if we know that the consequences of liberalizing marijuana use are smaller, why would we want to do that if we think that there's exposure to harm potential? We have to draw the line somewhere, right?
Well, part of it is that you have a thriving illegal market. So the fact of making it illegal hasn't hampered consumption at all, and all you're doing is, supporting sort of an entirely illegal network. The products aren't regulated. You're not capturing the tax dollars. You're not capturing the health benefits through lab testing and safe packaging to prevent children from accessing it and things like that. So you're sort of fighting the inevitable. And do you want to, do we want to continue to fight a failed war on drugs and pretend that it's working and pretend that this is a path, or do we want to sort of do the 180 and actually acknowledge the reality that there is a massive demand in this country for cannabis, and let's find a way to productively meet that demand.
Good.
And I think one of the biggest misnomers in the legalization debate is actually on the hands of the advocacy community. They're labeling these ballot initiatives as the campaign to regulate cannabis like alcohol. Cannabis is not regulated anything like alcohol. If a case of Budweiser or a keg of Coors Light falls off a truck, Budweiser isn't going to get shut down for 30 days. If a package of marijuana fails to get from the grow operation to a dispensary in Denver or Seattle, you can bet that operation is going to get either slowed down or shut down for a period of time. At the same time, a couple of 100,000 young black males aren't getting arrested every year because they smoke Marlboros. These are factors that go into the cannabis debate that are really pushing it in a direction toward reform. And it's one in which reform and regulation is much more hypervigilant for cannabis compared to alcohol or nicotine. But the effects of the regulation and the policies that we have in place nationally affect communities in very unique ways for cannabis compared to those other two substances.
Yeah. Following up on that, who benefits from continued criminalization of marijuana? Who's harmed most and who benefits?
Industrial prison system.
Yeah, the police departments help balance budgets. Asset forfeiture and things like that matter a lot. That is decreasing in some areas for sure. But there's also something cultural about this, and it's cultural across the country and in a lot of professions. In a lot of cases, in a lot of states, it's hard to find doctors who will write recommendations for medical marijuana because the medical community is conservative. It was raised, that most of that community, again, was raised in a time when this had no medical value. Police departments tend to be conservative, particularly police leadership. If you poll rank and file police officers, about 2/3 support legalization. If you poll police chiefs, they'll laugh at you. There are a lot of groups that still believe all of the drug war myths, that many of which have been disproven or at least tweaked in certain ways. And so even if someone is not benefiting from it, they are still, in a lot of ways, addicted to the outdated rhetoric that cannot let them let that go.
Tina, how about the current system that we've got? We have a real patchworky system. Is there anybody who benefits from maintaining that sort of like halfway system that we currently have?
I guess the benefit maybe accrues in each state because, for instance, the company I work for, we have operations in 5 states where we're growing and processing and then selling at a retail store various medical marijuana products. And in each state, we have to really recreate our company and have an entirely new team of people on the ground and build a $10 million grow facility and staff it up and buy all the equipment. And you lose any economies of scale doing it that way. So bad for a company, great for local economies.
Interesting.
Other than that, I don't know what else.
Yeah, that's good. You're also the founder and president of Illinois Women for Cannabis, or in Cannabis. In Cannabis. And so it's a nonprofit promoting women's role in Illinois' medical cannabis industry. So why do you think specifically that medical cannabis, or cannabis generally, is an opportunity for women specifically?
Well, what you see is really unusual in this industry, which is an entirely illegal market exists for years and years, and then either through a voter referendum or legislation, suddenly you have a brand new legalized market hitting a state where what I saw for Illinois was the field is wide open. There is no entrenched notion of this is a male-dominated industry, or men know how to grow this and sell this, and women don't. Nobody has that first mover advantage. The legalized market really is, as I said, it's just a wide open field. So, my goal in founding this organization was to raise awareness with women and provide education and outreach and networking and things like that to say, this is sort of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity where you have this brand new industry come to your state and get in on it early, see the opportunities early, and that way it doesn't become a male-dominated industry. It's just one that's racially diverse, gender diverse in every other way, rather than playing that catch-up game that we're seeing in every other industry.
And I think for medical marijuana in particular, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I am, because I've talked to a lot of women about this and they've told me this is not my own creation, is that caretakers tend to be disproportionately female in this country. If you have a sick child, if you have a sick parent, it tends to be a wife or a mother or a daughter who is caring for those people and not a son or a husband or a father. And if that means providing medical cannabis to help someone who is sick, women are on the front lines for that. In addition to that, you have some disorders that cannabis is used for with some efficacy that disproportionately affect women, like MS. for instance. And so women have sort of a natural constituency to understand the medical value of cannabis. And I think for a lot of women, at least the women I've spoken to who have gotten into the industry, many of them are in it because they have a child with epilepsy, or they had a mother who, or father who died of cancer, or a mother who has MS. And that is that motivator, not just a profit motive, although, making it in business is certainly a drive for a lot of people, but actually using what they have seen in their lifetime and the actions that they've undertaken in their lifetime and being able to help others who are similarly situated is a real motivator in this industry, especially for women.
Now, I have a ton more questions, but I want to ask one more kind of question pairing, and then I want to turn to the audience, because I think that's where the interesting discussion will happen. So I want to urge you to, if you haven't yet, go ahead and put questions in, and I'll receive those and look at them. So now, it seems to me, at a broad level, if we were redoing drug policy from scratch, just like if we were building cars for the first time, we probably wouldn't use internal combustion engines, right? We'd build something better now. If we were starting over, we would have a very different drug policy. But we have a long history of imprisoning people for possession, which seems to be heavily racialized. We have state and federal wrangling over authority that has a long history. We have a distribution system that's deeply connected to criminal behavior, as you noted, beyond the fact that it's a controlled substance, I mean. So how plausible is it that we can just move toward commercialization or legalization of marijuana in a way that's unproblematic and just, given that fact? Is it as easy as sort of changing the federal laws, or is it more complicated than that? And I'll give it to both of you.
I'll jump in first. So having a history of about 80 years in which marijuana was effectively criminalized and then formally criminalized, and that the conversation around cannabis began in a racial manner, right? So the term marijuana was not the initial term for the product in the United States. If you go back to the 1800s, cannabis was a medical product. It wasn't used that widely, but cannabis was a medical product. And then the Spanish-American War ended, and something interesting happened. There was a huge flow of immigration across America's southwest border into states and into territories. And shocking as this may seem today, there was a government effort to turn public opinion against Mexican immigrants. And part of that meant using a word that sounded foreign. Cannabis didn't sound foreign, but marijuana did. And eventually that anti-Mexican immigrant use of marijuana changed to where marijuana was a jazz drug. That was a drug used here in Chicago and in New Orleans and in Harlem. And while there was a purpose to target Mexican Americans or Mexican immigrants, now it was a way to vilify African Americans. You don't shed that because Congress passes a law. You don't change perception and the institutionalization of this product as being bad and the users being bad, which our Attorney General of the United States likes to say, overnight. It takes not just legal change, but it takes generational change, and it takes sort of a mental transformation among people to think differently about this product. Not to say that it's safe in all cases, not to say that everyone should have it, not to say that there's no risks. People will make those arguments, and they're all nonsensical arguments. But just to think differently about it is a tremendous undertaking.
I agree. And, would it look different if you started from scratch? Sure. But I agree. It's just this is the messy place we find ourselves. The roots are messy. And, we're looking at Canada, which has a very different history in terms of legalization. They don't have kind of the very racist history with it, as far as I know, that we do. And they're a little bit ahead of us. Canada is legalizing nationally this coming year. And so we'll get a very, very short preview of what that alternative looks like.
Yeah.
And so, and they are having a messy rollout as well. I think trying to do anything on a national scale is just challenging.
Yeah. So I'm getting great questions here, and one of them I want to, one of them I'd like to, I'm seeing several here that are related to other countries. So just on that front, and since you mentioned Canada, how is that going to change the U.S.'s policy, if at all? And if I can hijack it a little bit, I'm curious especially about NAFTA. I don't know if that's too wonky, but you've got to our north and south, you've got more liberal drug policy, at least with respect to marijuana. So does that have any impact?
Well, I think Canada looks safe to the United States, right? So the first country in the world to legalize marijuana on a national scale was Uruguay. Uruguay is a weird country that's somewhere else, and it's not a white neighbor, to be honest. And so who cares what Uruguay does? But when Canada does something, the United States looks at it a little more closely. And so, yeah, I think that legitimizes that policy decision in a way that Uruguay's decision a few years prior did not. Does it end up pushing government officials to act in a certain way? I don't think so. Maybe it changes the minds of a few border state elected officials, but especially in the environment we're in now, people aren't keen on taking cues from other countries, particularly on an issue like that. In terms of NAFTA, it's not going to matter. It's against international law for a nation to legalize marijuana. So Canada is violating international agreements, and it is certainly against international law to start shipping it across national borders. In addition, you can imagine the United States, once it will be in really two places. The first is continuing to say that marijuana is illegal in all circumstances. When the United States reforms, they're going to say, we do it better here. We're going to produce our own marijuana, and it's against international law to ship it across international lines. So we're going to create our own national market that no one is allowed into. I think there's a gentleman in the White House who has a perspective on trade that would support that. I think there are a lot of people in Congress who have a perspective on trade that would support that. And I think ultimately international transfers of cannabis from outside of the United States, inside the United States, will be seen as so risky, even if it's not, will be seen as so risky that an easy policy argument can be made for cannabis protectionism.
I totally agree. And, companies are making massive investments in their businesses in the U.S. And what we're seeing in Canada is growers are investing, literally hundreds of millions of dollars into massive growth facilities where they're going to supply, large swaths of Canada. And it's putting people in the U.S. on edge. Very much people are closely watching, and they're also seeing, one of the most interesting developments we've seen yet was that last month, Constellation Brands, which is one of the largest alcohol distributors in the country, made an almost $200 million investment in a Canadian marijuana company. That is by far the biggest investment made by any mainstream company of its kind. It's coming from the alcohol industry, meaning they see what's coming. They're betting that rather than try to just edge out marijuana as a competitor, they're going to find some nexus there by having marijuana-infused drinks. They're already set up for manufacturing beverages. So we're going to see a lot of innovation and investment there. And for U.S. companies, marijuana companies that are looking to grow, and they see $200 million go north of the border, that is really raising the stakes in the U.S. and putting on pressure to bring federal legalization in the U.S. so that that money can stay within our borders.
Great. Well, I'd like to turn to the physical audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and the only rule is that it be a question. Okay. So right over here. Wait 1 second, just wait for the microphone so that we can hear you.
How would the legalization of marijuana affect the prison system and the legal system in the United States of America?
Well, about 800,000 people are arrested every year for a marijuana crime. Now, to be fair and to put that into perspective, not all of those individuals are arrested solely for a marijuana crime, nor are all of those crimes charged against people who would be able to avoid them in states that have legalized. So what does that mean? Imagine someone is pulled over for speeding, right? They're not high on marijuana, but they get arrested for a misdemeanor speeding violation because they're going, let's say, 100 miles an hour, and you search the car and they find marijuana. Well, that's considered a marijuana offense. Now, that's a little different than a stop and frisk that produces a joint on someone, right? So too would, a burglary or something else. These marijuana offenses get folded into other crimes as well. And also possessing, 2 or 3 pounds of marijuana in Colorado is not legal, even though they have legalized. And so it is not as if legalization will eliminate all marijuana charges in the US, but for perspective, marijuana arrests in Colorado have dropped over 90% since legalization has happened. That means a hell of a lot fewer people are going to jail or paying fines, or more importantly, I would argue, being introduced to the criminal justice system for the first time. Now, people do not tend to go to jail for simple possession, for possessing a couple of joints, although in some states that is the case, and if you are a person of color, it is more likely to happen than if you are white. But what it means for simple arrests, and then what I would argue is the trajectory of life for the individuals who face those initial arrests can change dramatically, even if prison populations don't drop, and even if still thousands of people are arrested for certain marijuana offenses every year.
Well, I want to tag on to that, one of the top questions that we got, since we're on the topic, which is what do we do with the people who are currently incarcerated for either just possession or for marijuana-related offenses where they've gotten a longer sentence, say, because of possession or because of involvement in the drug?
Yeah, I mean, that I think is a great question, and has, as far as I can tell, a very complicated answer, because everything still has to work its way through a judicial system. It's not as if you can just open the doors of the prisons and say, roam free. And as John said, the population of people who are in jail solely for marijuana possession is pretty small compared to people where that was maybe the precipitating of, a reason for the arrest, where later other problems were encountered, or it was just one of several charges brought against somebody. But, what we're seeing in Illinois as part of the decriminalization bill that passed was a program for expungement, so that if that was the reason that you were arrested, you can now work your way through a specific court system and have that removed from your record.
Great. Back to the audience. I think you had your hand up here. Just wait 1 second while we get a microphone. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering, what are the marijuana businesses doing with their cash proceeds, and how are they getting their cash proceeds into the financial system without opening a business account for their marijuana businesses?
So there's a perception out there that no marijuana businesses have bank accounts. It's not true. It really depends what state you're in. So for instance, I think most, if not all, of the marijuana businesses operating in Illinois do have a business banking account. We're fortunate in Illinois, there's only one bank that is willing to bank these businesses. In other states like Nevada, as far as I know, nobody has a bank, and there's massive amounts of cash moving around the system there. So one of the biggest proponents for change, or one of the biggest factors people are arguing for change on the federal policy level, is to open up access to banking. As you can imagine, it's a massive security risk for everybody involved in states where there are literally hundreds of millions of dollars of cash moving around on a daily basis.
It creates opportunities for bad behavior, right? So what I argue is, if you support marijuana reform, you should be the second person in line asking for marijuana businesses to have access to banking. If you oppose marijuana reform, you should be at the front of the line. Because under a system in which you have permissive marijuana policies and no access to banking, the consequences, not just for safety, for the safety of consumers, for the safety of producers, et cetera, is high. but for the ability to money launder is significant. The irony is the reason the reason cannabis businesses do not have access to banking is because of anti-money laundering statutes that Congress has passed. So the consequence of those anti-money laundering statutes is that they make it a hell of a lot easier for cannabis businesses to launder money. The outcome, the intent of that legislation is great. The policy consequences, given the current environment, are upside down.
Back to the audience, right here in the front.
You mentioned the alcohol company investing $200 million. Is big money kind of already moved in, or is there still room for small entrepreneurs, like doing edibles and things like that? So what are the commercial opportunities, the entrepreneurial opportunities?
Oh, there's still massive entrepreneurial opportunities in this industry. Again, because you're looking at each industry state by state rather than on a national basis like you saw that investment in Canada. Yeah, absolutely. Right now, Ohio is holding a competitive application process for getting a license to open a retail dispensary, the retail store where you can purchase the product. It costs $5,000 to apply, to actually submit your application, and you might spend $50,000, let's say, putting together your application and hiring experts and consultants and things like that. But really for let's call it a $50,000 investment, which you could pull together with a group of people, you have an opportunity to make a lot more than that in that market. So and same thing with edibles. In Colorado, you're seeing a huge cottage industry of edibles makers. California, we haven't even talked about California today, which is really the sleeping giant. That California legalized adult use, it goes into effect January 1. They've had a so-called medical market for 30 years. It's been really a pseudo-recreational market where you can get your medical card over the internet in an hour. So we're going to see this conversion from a really sort of fake medical market that makes a liar out of most of the people involved into a much more legitimate, regulated adult use market that's going to be a multi-billion-dollar market on some level just getting off the ground with massive opportunities for entrepreneurs.
Right here, man. Right.
Hi, this question is specifically for Illinois. How many years would you say, Ms. Roman, that Illinois is from having actual coffee shops where people can go and consume and buy recreationally without being in trouble?
Well, coffee shops, a while. Even Colorado, interestingly, they have now more retail dispensaries than they do Starbucks. They have thousands of them. But you can't consume inside the store. You can't consume, really, in most hotel rooms, there's still no smoking. You can't consume in public. It's a real head scratcher right now for Colorado where you can, buy it and you can sell it, but where the heck are you supposed to be able to smoke it? And they don't have, bars or cafes yet that are allowing it. So I think we're still in Illinois years away from that. I would bet that we will have just legalized adult use, though, in less than 2 years.
I want to ask some students here, so go ahead in the front.
Do you think a change in international law is imminent regarding marijuana trade and import and export?
So international law will probably be the last shoe to drop in this space. In a lot of cases, especially with drug policy, the United States leads the way in terms of this type of policy, in terms of international policy. The current standing international agreement is the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, which was initially passed in the 1960s, and there were amendments to it in the 1980s. It will probably be an international legal environment for quite some time, which looks a heck of a lot like the federal environment does right now, where federal law exists right now that says marijuana is illegal in all circumstances. International law says marijuana is illegal for recreational purposes, but there can be exceptions for scientific research and for medical use. And the federal government is looking the other way. My guess is the United Nations will spend quite a bit of time looking the other way, especially if the system is operating fine at the national level, at the state level, because it is you have to spend a lot of political capital to change an international agreement or get rid of an international agreement or to produce a new one. And if the system is working all right, why spend that capital on that when you should be spending your political capital on something else in the international community? And I assume you'll agree with me, there are much bigger fish to fry right now than marijuana when it comes to international affairs. So I think that's something that will go into this limbo period and maybe never get addressed, but if it gets addressed, it'll be long after the United States legalizes and other larger nations do as well. That's my take.
The gentleman here in the aisle.
Yeah, I was wondering about the process for licensing both dispensaries and grow facilities, and do we see states allowing vertical integration between the two?
Yeah, the question was whether you can have, be vertically integrated where you're growing it and selling it. Absolutely yes. I'm not aware of any states that prohibit that. Some states had mandated it. Colorado had that model where you could only sell at a retail store what you had grown, but that has loosened up. And I think the more common model that we're seeing now is each phase of this is a different competitive process. You can wind up with licenses to grow it and sell it, or you could specialize in one or the other. And we're, as part of the state experimentation that we're seeing all around, is some states are very much restricting the number of licenses available to grow it or sell it. They feel that in order to regulate the program the way that the federal government requires, they need a small number of companies to regulate. Otherwise, they don't have the resources to do it the right way. Other states like Colorado, really don't limit the number of licenses. California is really, for the most part, not limiting the number of licenses. So we're seeing experimentation for the business owners, like which state are you better off in? One where there's very low cost to entry, it's not competitive. Anybody who can scrape together a couple nickels can try to have an edibles business. But there's also massive amounts of competition and you're more likely to go out of business. Are you better off in a restricted market? Where are the patients doing better? Where are the prices higher? Where are the regulators finding that they're more effective in regulating versus less? I mean, there's just a lot of experimentation going on, a lot of different levels.
Way in the back there, standing in the back. He had his hand up first. No.
Thank you. It was really a good presentation. I was curious if you have any knowledge or background on why Prohibition took place in the first place and kind of what society looked like back then and what were the reasons for Prohibition. Was it just that lawmakers and people in power just had preferences for alcohol and tobacco versus it and whatnot, or were there deeper issues or morals or things like they were thinking about when they...
So there were a few forces that were coming together at the right time or the wrong time, depending on how you look at it. I had mentioned earlier the racialization of the product was a very important factor in the early debate around this. Around that time, post-Spanish-American War, you have a period where the growth of the administrative state in the United States is skyrocketing, right? After progressive reforms began, and then post-World War I and post-World War II, the size and the reach of the state grew significantly. The Supreme Court's reinterpretation of the Commerce Clause gave the federal government significant new regulatory authority, and starting in the early 1900s with the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and continuing forward with other pieces of legislation, governments began, both at the state but particularly at the federal level, to try to get their arms around this. Marijuana wasn't the only drug that was thrown into this mix. Of course, alcohol was for a period of time. Opium was as well. Opium has a very similar path in a lot of ways. It was treated as a narcotic drug, it is. And it was seen as something that was a threat to society. It was also a way to vilify outgroups. In the case of opium, it was Asian immigrants and Asian Americans who were victims in that discussion. But then you also had, in addition to these forces, these sort of broader societal forces, you had individual personalities who were having a significant role. So Harry Anslinger was an individual who was in charge of the Bureau of Narcotics in the Department of Justice. He was an old prohibition regulator, and he had a very passionate hatred for marijuana and marijuana users and people of other races. And he peddled stories before Congress in open hearings and in the media and in conjunction with media tycoons to vilify not just the drug, but to terrify people about what it was doing to communities. The movie Reefer Madness grew out of this movement. And that set America on a path toward total prohibition of this substance that every government official who was worth their weight was constantly banging the drum that this was bad. And it led to what is the drug war of today through Richard Nixon and through Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton and forward. And so it started because of a lot of forces coming together and then began on this path that was really uninterrupted.
I'll ask a student question here. So right in the very front.
Do you know of any reasonable arguments against the national legalization of marijuana?
I've never been asked that question. That's actually really great because I get asked a lot of questions over and over.
Right, when you say reasonable, rational arguments, that's what makes it tough. Really.
What I'll say is there are definitely, marijuana is something that needs to be regulated, and it is something that can be regulated incorrectly. You were mentioning California's medical system before. That is a system that is not regulated well. There are risks, and people will tell you that it's risk-free, but it's not. One of the biggest risks with marijuana is capitalizing on heavy users. So there's something called the 80-20 rule when it comes to cannabis. It's also true for nicotine and alcohol as well, but though the numbers are a little bit different. 80% of the product, cannabis, is consumed by 20% of users. And there is a motivation with some products, opioids are one of them, to make sure that heavy users keep using more heavily. And that can cause health risks, and it can cause other social issues. I think reasonable arguments like that are not put into the forefront. The real response to that is not prohibition, but actual more responsible regulation. And so to your question, I don't think there are reasonable bases or rational reasons to do this, because prohibition has clearly failed. There is a better system. It is not the one that we have currently. It might not be the one that exists in Colorado or Washington or California or Connecticut or Illinois, but prohibition is not the answer. Better regulation is.
What about, so as long as the business is destroying bad arguments, what about the slippery slope argument, right? I mean, I'm sure that's the one that you hear the most. People will say, well, look, if self-harm is the worry here, then let's look at other things that don't seem to self-harm. Ecstasy, maybe heroin under certain circumstances.
I mean, I taught a law course last semester. There was a cannabis law course, and students could pick their final paper topic. And one of the students, his thesis was that LSD is next, that there's a lot of compelling reasons why LSD should be able to be used, in micro doses for medical reasons. And so, yeah, I suppose that, once you legalize cannabis, then, maybe things like that do become the next conversation. And I think what we should have learned by now as a country is, so then let's have that conversation. Let's look at the medical, justifications for it. Let's see if there really is a basis to do it or not. And, let's let reason and science prevail over that. And if it's really not medically beneficial, or if it really is too risky, then no. But, let's get past that phase that we've had for the last 70 years of just that automatic knee-jerk reaction of thinking that that's, beyond the pale.
Okay. Go ahead.
What role are the tobacco companies playing in legalization, production, as well as marketing?
I'm not familiar with them having any significant role in that space. There are a lot of rumors and conspiracy theories out there about big tobacco trying to take over. There may be evidence of that. I do this for a living and haven't seen it, but I think there is also there would be a real hesitance among state regulators and even among consumers, particularly when it comes to tobacco, about how those companies would be treated in that process, given the damage that tobacco companies have done to this nation. Now, the same argument can be made for alcohol companies, but alcohol companies are far less vilified in the United States than tobacco companies are. Whether that's right or wrong, I won't say. But yeah, I haven't seen significant evidence of it.
Well, I'm going to ask one final question, kind of drawing from this stuff here to sum it up, and it's specifically about Illinois. So at least part of the reason for wanting to liberalize marijuana access in Illinois is to solve the economic problems of the state. So what do you think about that? Do you think that that's plausibly can help improve the state's finances, or is that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Colorado has just about half the population of Illinois. And they did over $1 billion in sales last year of marijuana products, which resulted in well in excess of $100 million of tax revenue. I think it was
over 200.
Over 200. I was going to say that was 2 years ago. It was about 100 million.
Fees,
so,
yeah.
You think about $400 million of tax revenue in Illinois. I think it's unconscionable at this point for our legislators not to consider it. And they can hold their nose if they, for them, they are fine with alcohol. They want to hold their nose about cannabis, okay, but. For a state is in horrific financial condition as our state, I don't think legislators are going to be able to justify ignoring that kind of tax revenue.
Here's what I'll say. It is helpful. Right now, I think one of the myths that exists, and this is a straw man argument, but this idea that, oh my God, if we legalize marijuana in Illinois, suddenly there's going to be marijuana in Illinois. Right? It's here, and people who are selling it, are, with the exception of the medical market, are selling it illegally. So these revenue streams are happening. The state is foolish not to want to tap into those revenue streams to extract tax revenue. That said, your budget in the state is in a mess. Cannabis is not going to fix your budget situation. It's going to help a little bit, and it's going to help using economic activity that is already present in the state. But there are definitely, and I'm certainly not saying that this is what you were arguing, but there are people in states that are trying to pass legislation or initiatives who paint this picture that all of your budget problems are going to be solved if you do this. And that is very dangerous, because when that doesn't come to pass, people say, well, why do we still have a budget deficit after we legalized marijuana? The reality is it's money that will help. It's money that can go help build schools and help with mental health and addiction services and a variety of things. But in a state like this, with a budget like this, you're going to need to legalize a lot more than marijuana. How's that? And maybe use it some more, too.
So it appears the future is verdant in at least one way. But thank you very much for your attention, and let's thank our speakers.
Great working with you.